The boardroom on the 99th floor of Vought Tower was no longer a sanctuary of corporate sterility, but a cage smelling of sulfur and wet copper. Ashley Barrett was on her knees near the shattered main display screen, clawing at her own throat as if trying to dig out a voice that had been stolen, while Homelander stood at the head of the obsidian table, vibrating with a frequency of rage that usually preceded a massacre. This was not the clean, manageable panic of a Compound V leak or a collateral damage cover-up, because this was the collapse of the fundamental laws that governed their reality, and there was no public relations strategy for the impossible. 3 minutes ago, the soup known as Blind Spot, who had been rehabilitating in the lower labs, had walked into the room not with his usual cane and heightened senses, but floating 6 inches off the carpet, with eyes burning like ignited magnesium. He had not spoken in words, but in a telepathic shriek that shattered every window from the 80th floor up, and he had demanded to speak to the man in the red suit before his body simply unraveled. It did not explode in the traditional sense of biological failure, but untied itself, like a knot of wet meat separating muscle from bone, in a slow, agonizing display that defied biology. Now there was a stain on the carpet that was smoking and whispering in a language that the Vought linguistic database could not identify. Homelander stared at the stain with his laser vision ready, the red glow illuminating the terror on the faces of the Deep and A-Train. But he hesitated for the first time in his life. The strongest being on the planet hesitated because he could not target the enemy, and he could not burn a whisper. The air in the room grew heavy and hot, as if the climate control had been replaced by the breath of a furnace. Queen Maeve was the first to notice that the blood on the floor was moving, and it was not flowing downhill or soaking into the fibers, but crawling. The red liquid pulled itself together, ignoring gravity and surface tension, forming intricate geometric patterns that hurt the eyes to look at, while a low hum began to emanate from the walls of the tower itself, a vibration that felt like a heartbeat, much larger and slower than a human heart. Down on the streets of New York, the chaos was just beginning to register as screens in Times Square that usually played loop after loop of Vought propaganda were flickering with static that formed distinct smiling faces. Cars were stopping not because of traffic, but because the drivers were falling asleep at the wheel, simultaneously dreaming of things they had never seen. In the boardroom, the crawling blood finished its work, forming a perfect circle with strange, jagged runes etching themselves into the expensive floor materials. Homelander stepped forward, his boots crunching on the glass, and he demanded to know who was doing this. He screamed for Stan Edgar, and he screamed for the cameras to be cut, even though they had been dead for minutes. The whisper from the floor grew louder, answering him not with fear, but with amusement. It was a sound that made the hairs on Homelander's arms stand up, because it was the sound of a predator that did not care about strength or durability or public opinion. The air pressure dropped so sharply that A-Train's nose began to bleed, and the lights flickered and died, plunging the most powerful beings on Earth into darkness that felt thick and oily. In that darkness, a match was struck. The flame was small, but it illuminated a face that was sitting in Homelander's chair. The figure was wearing a pristine white suit that seemed to catch the light of the match and amplify it. He held a piece of parchment in one hand and a fountain pen in the other. He did not look at the soup surrounding him, but looked at the smoking remains of Blind Spot and tutted softly, a sound of disappointed management. When he finally looked up, his eyes were not red like Homelander's lasers, but a deep, infinite black that swallowed the light. He smiled, and the temperature in the room rose another 10 degrees. He placed the parchment on the table and smoothed it out. He spoke, and his voice sounded like it was coming from inside their own heads. He apologized for the mess and said that the previous applicant had not read the fine print. He looked directly at Homelander, who was floating now, eyes glowing with lethal intent. The man in the white suit did not flinch. He merely tapped the paper with his pen. He said he was there to renegotiate the terms of their lease on reality. He said his name was Mephisto, and he was a very big fan of their work. Homelander fired. 2 beams of concentrated heat capable of slicing through aircraft carriers slammed into the man in the white suit. The explosion blew out the back wall of the conference room, sending debris raining down onto the streets below. Smoke filled the space. Maeve shielded her eyes, coughing. When the smoke cleared, the chair was gone, and the table was slag, but the man was standing in the air, unaffected, untouched, and still smiling. He brushed a speck of dust from his lapel. He told Homelander that was a very rude way to start a business partnership. This was not a fight. This was a hostile takeover. The silence that followed Mephisto's statement was not the absence of sound, but the suffocating pressure of a predator asserting dominance over a lesser species. Homelander hovered in the debris-strewn air of the boardroom, his chest heaving with a mixture of confusion and a primal terror he had never experienced since the womb. His laser vision, the ultimate trump card that had cowed nations and melted steel, had washed over the man in the white suit like a warm breeze. Mephisto dusted off his shoulder again with an exaggerated fastidiousness that felt more insulting than a slap. He looked around the room at the terrified members of the 7. Queen Maeve was gripping the edge of the shattered table, her knuckles white, while A-Train was vibrating so hard he was blurring at the edges, a physiological response to the overwhelming instinct to run away from something that his speed could not outpace. The Deep was huddled in the corner, whispering to himself, his gills fluttering rapidly as they tried to process oxygen that felt suddenly too thin and tainted with brimstone. Mephisto ignored them all and turned his gaze back to Homelander, who slowly lowered himself to the ground, though he did not deactivate the red glow in his eyes. It was a bluff now, and everyone in the room knew it. The hierarchy of power, which had been the singular defining truth of the Vought universe, had just been decapitated. Mephisto walked over to the wet stain that used to be Blind Spot and shook his head with mock sympathy. He commented that the boy had a very loud soul for someone so quiet, and that it was a shame to waste such raw material. He snapped his fingers, and the blood on the floor boiled, instantly evaporating into a red mist that hung in the air for a second before being sucked into the ruby ring on Mephisto's finger. The display was casual and horrific, a demonstration of economy that terrified the Supes more than the violence itself. The doors to the conference room slid open, and Stan Edgar walked in. He did not look at the hole in the wall, or the traumatized superheroes, or the demonic entity standing in the center of his office. He looked at his watch. He walked past Mephisto and took his seat at the head of the table, or at least where the head of the table used to be before it was slagged. He placed his briefcase on a piece of unburnt mahogany and folded his hands. He addressed the intruder with the same tone he used for shareholders who asked tedious questions. He asked if there was a reason the quarterly earnings meeting had been interrupted by a magic show. Mephisto laughed a sound that made the glass in the remaining windows crack. He pulled a chair from thin air, a high-backed Gothic throne made of bone and leather, and sat opposite Edgar. He commended Edgar's composure, stating that it was rare to find a human who had sold his soul so thoroughly that he no longer feared the buyer. Edgar did not blink. He simply asked for the intruder's name and business model. Mephisto introduced himself again, not as a villain, but as a consultant. He explained that Vought International was in the business of manufacturing false gods, but their product was flawed. Compound 5 was biology, and biology was messy. It aged, it broke, it had PR crises. Mephisto offered a partnership. He proposed a merger between Vought's infrastructure and his own proprietary resources. He called it a transition from biological supremacy to spiritual equity. Homelander stepped forward, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. He demanded to know what Mephisto was. He screamed that he was the only god in the sky. Mephisto looked at him with pity. He told Homelander that he was not a god, but a bad product of a laboratory test tube, a frantic collection of neuroses wrapped in a flag. He told Homelander that he smelled like spoiled milk and desperate need. Homelander lunged, moving faster than the speed of sound, his fist aimed directly at Mephisto's heart. There was no impact. Homelander passed through Mephisto as if the man were made of smoke crashing into the wall behind him. Mephisto did not even turn around. He continued talking to Edgar, explaining that his domain was expanding, and he needed a retail presence in this dimension. Vought had the market share. Mephisto had the supply. He offered true immortality. Not the pseudo-durability of the soups, but actual deathlessness. He offered the ability to rewrite the laws of physics without a lab. In exchange, he wanted rights. Not money, but the exclusive rights to the fallout. He wanted the despair. He wanted the corruption. He wanted the souls of the heroes Vought created. Edgar listened quietly. He asked for a demonstration of value beyond parlor tricks. Mephisto smiled and the room plunged into a hallucination. For a moment, the boardroom was gone, replaced by a desolate landscape of burning iron and weeping stone. The seven saw themselves stripped of their skins, their muscles exposed, their powers turned against them in an eternity of ironic torture. A-Train was running on stumps. The deep was drowning in dry sand. Homelander was chained to a rock, being loved by millions of faceless corpses who tore at his flesh with adoration. The vision lasted only a second, but when it ended, the smell of ozone and fear was so thick it was palpable. Edgar adjusted his glasses. He said they could discuss terms, but he would need to see the contract. Mephisto produced a scroll of human skin and a quill made of bone. The negotiation had begun. Miles away in a basement beneath a pawn shop in the Flatiron district, Billy Butcher was trying to watch a rugby match on a television that was refusing to hold a signal. The screen kept flickering with static that looked suspiciously like screaming faces. Huey Campbell was sitting on a crate, nervously tapping his foot, while Frenchie dismantled a canister of stolen Compound Vive. Mother's Milk was reviewing surveillance footage from a drone they had parked near Vought Tower. The mood was tense but routine until the drone feed cut out. Not just to static, but to a solid block of red. MM tapped the screen, cursing. He said the drone wasn't jammed, but fried. He said the sensors picked up a heat signature that spiked off the charts before the camera died. Butcher grunted, telling him it was probably just Homelander having a tantrum and lasering a bird. Frenchie interrupted. He was holding a pipette of the Compound 5 up to the light. His goggles were magnifying his eyes, which were wide with confusion. He said the chemistry was wrong. The liquid in the vial was usually a vibrant blue. Now it was swirling with black streaks that seemed to be moving against the current. He said it looked like the sample was alive. Butcher walked over and snatched the vial. He held it up. The black streaks coalesced, forming a tiny eye that looked back at him. Butcher dropped the vial. It didn't shatter. It bounced with a dull thud and rolled under the table. Frenchie scrambled after it. He said the molecular structure had changed spontaneously. He said the V was reacting to something in the atmosphere, something that wasn't radiation. Kimiko, who had been sitting quietly in the corner watching a soap opera, suddenly stood up. She walked to the center of the room and sniffed the air. She made a sharp, guttural sound and pointed at the ceiling. She signed to Frenchie. Frenchie translated. He said she smells something old. She says it smells like the basement of the shiny tower, but everywhere. She says a door has been opened. Butcher frowned. He didn't like riddles. He liked targets. He told them to pack up. If Vought was cooking up a new batch of juice that made the V go wonky, they needed to know about it. He grabbed his crowbar. He didn't know that a crowbar would be as useful as a toothpick against what was coming. The world outside had shifted in subtle ways. The shadows in the alleyway seemed longer and deeper. A stray cat hissed at them as they loaded into the van, its eyes glowing with an unnatural intelligence. As they drove towards the disturbance reported on the police scanner, the radio kept jumping stations, settling on a gospel channel where the preacher was screaming not about salvation, but about the arrival of the landlord. The scanner led them to a warehouse district in Queens. A low-level soup, known as Shockwave, not the speedster, but a D-list electrical hero, was reportedly holding hostages. When the boys arrived, the police were already there, hiding behind their cruisers. But they weren't firing. They were shaking. Butcher got out of the van and looked through his binoculars. Shockwave was floating above the warehouse entrance, but he wasn't generating electricity. He was generating fire, and the fire was black. He was screaming in a language that sounded like grinding metal. Butcher watched as a SWAT officer stood up and fired a sniper round. The bullet hit Shockwave's chest and melted instantly, turning into a droplet of molten lead that splashed harmlessly against his skin. Shockwave laughed. He pointed a finger at the police car. The car didn't explode. It imploded. It crunched inward as if crushed by a giant invisible hand, then burst into the same black flames. Butcher lowered the binoculars. He looked at Huey. He said this wasn't V. This was something else. He said they needed to leave. Now. But it was too late. Shockwave had seen them. The soup turned his head 180 degrees, snapping his neck with a sickening crack, but he didn't die. He just kept smiling. He swooped down, landing on the hood of the van. The heat was intense, blistering the paint instantly. Frenchie gunned the engine, reversing hard. Shockwave held on his fingers, digging into the metal like it was clay. He looked through the windshield at Butcher. He spoke. But it wasn't Shockwave's voice. It was a multitude of voices layered over each other. He said the master sends his regards to the butcher. He said the meat is almost ready. Kimiko kicked the door open and launched herself onto the hood. She slashed at Shockwave's face. Her claws, which could tear through Kevlar, raked across his cheek. There was no blood, only light. Bright, blinding light poured out of the wound. Shockwave backhanded her, sending her flying through a brick wall 50 feet away. Butcher realized then that the rules of engagement had been rewritten. He ordered MM to fire the rocket launcher. MM hesitated for a fraction of a second, fearful of hitting Kimiko, but he pulled the trigger. The rocket slammed into Shockwave's chest. The explosion was massive. When the smoke cleared, the van's windshield was shattered and the hood was gone. Shockwave was standing in the crater. His suit was torn, revealing skin that looked like magma. He was growing. His muscles were expanding, tearing the human form apart. Horns were pushing through his skull. He was becoming a vessel. Butcher realized they couldn't fight this. Not with bullets. He shouted for Frenchie to drive. They spun around, leaving Kimiko to regenerate in the rubble, hoping she would catch up. As they sped away, Butcher looked back. The thing that used to be Shockwave was not chasing them. It was kneeling. It was drawing a circle in the asphalt with its finger. The circle ignited. Something was climbing out of it. Back at Vought Tower, the sun had set, but the lights had not come on. The building was running on emergency power. In the deeper levels of the science division, Dr. Vogelbaum came out of retirement at Edgar's request. He stood behind a lead glass partition, looking at the sample Mephisto had left behind. A single drop of his blood that he had graciously offered for analysis. The blood was in a containment field. The sensors were screaming. The radiation levels were 0, but the energy output was infinite. It defied thermodynamics. The blood was creating energy from nothing. It was heating the room without losing mass. Vogelbaum looked at the readout. He told Edgar over the intercom that this wasn't biological. He said if he didn't know better, he would say it was magic. Edgar, standing in the observation deck, replied that magic was just science they hadn't monetized yet. He told Vogelbaum to synthesize it. He wanted to know if it could be mixed with compound Vive. Vogelbaum warned him that the V was reacting aggressively to the proximity alone. The samples in the storage lockers were boiling. He said mixing them might create a reaction they couldn't control. Edgar didn't care. He saw the ultimate product. A soup that didn't just break laws but rewrote reality. He ordered the synthesis. Vogelbaum's hand trembled as he initiated the sequence. The robotic arm lowered the needle into the drop of Mephisto's blood. As soon as the metal touched the liquid, the containment unit screamed. The blood didn't wait to be drawn. It climbed up the needle. It infected the machine. The robotic arm began to twist, changing from steel to organic bone. The transformation spread up the mechanism into the computer systems. Screens turned into eyes. Keyboards sprouted teeth. The lab was being digested. Vogelbaum screamed as the glass in front of him shattered. The blood mist filled the room. It didn't kill the scientists. It changed them. It whispered to them. It offered them tenure. It offered them grants. It offered them the answers to the universe. Edgar watched on the monitor as his top research team began to tear each other apart, not in rage, but in a frenzy of ecstatic discovery, writing equations on the walls in their own blood. Edgar turned off the monitor. He turned to his assistant Ashley, who was weeping silently in the corner. He told her to draft a press release. He told her to say that Vought was exploring exciting new frontiers in bioenergy. He told her to schedule a meeting with the president. They were going to need a bigger budget. Upstairs, Homelander stood on the gargoyle of the 99th floor. He was looking at the city he owned, but it didn't feel like his anymore. He could feel the presence of the man in the white suit everywhere. It was in the wind. It was in the hum of the city. For the first time, Homelander felt small. He hated it. He felt a tear run down his cheek. He wiped it away furiously. A reflection appeared in the glass of the window next to him. It wasn't his reflection. It was Mephisto. The reflection smiled. It spoke without sound. It told Homelander that loneliness was a terrible thing for a god. It said that the people down there would never truly love him. They only loved the fear he provided. But Mephisto could give him real love. He could give him a world where every single human being was programmed to adore him, where he was the sun and the moon. All he had to do was let Mephisto in. All he had to do was sign the contract. Homelander looked at the reflection. He looked at the contract that had appeared in his hand. It was heavy. The paper was warm. He looked at the city below. He saw the chaos starting. Fires burning in Queens. Police sirens wailing. He knew he couldn't laser this problem away. He felt a crack in his mind. A fracture where his narcissism met his impotence. He looked at the reflection and asked what the catch was. Mephisto's reflection widened its grin. He said there was no catch, just a partnership. Homelander would be the face. Mephisto would be the management. Homelander gripped the pen. He didn't sign it yet, but he didn't throw it away. He put it in his pocket. He flew up into the clouds, seeking the silence of the upper atmosphere. But even there, the stars seemed to be rearranging themselves into a smile. The invasion had begun not with ships or armies, but with a signature on a lease. The boys were back in their hideout tending to Kimiko. She was healing, but the scars were glowing faintly. Frenchie was scanning her with a Geiger counter. It was clicking erratically. He said her biology was fighting an infection that wasn't viral. It was spiritual. Butcher sat at the table cleaning his gun. He looked at the empty vial of V. He looked at the TV where the news was reporting gas leaks across the city. He knew this was the big one. He knew they needed help. He picked up the phone. He didn't dial the CIA. He didn't dial the colonel. He dialed a number he had memorized years ago from a dusty book in his grandmother's attic. A number that wasn't supposed to work. A number for a priest who had been excommunicated for asking too many questions about the devil. If Vought was going to hell, Butcher was going to need an exorcist. But as he listened to the ringtone, he heard a click. The line was picked up. A voice on the other end didn't say hello. It said, "Hello, Billy. I've been waiting for your call." It was the voice from the warehouse. It was the voice from the boardroom. Mephisto had tapped the phone lines of fate itself. Butcher slammed the phone down. He looked at the boys. He said they were compromised. He said they were going dark, deeper than they had ever gone before. The stage was set. The players were on the board, and the dice were made of bone. The fallout from the Vought Plaza resurrection event was not a shockwave of radiation, but a tsunami of cognitive dissonance that broke the minds of the populace before it even touched their bodies. The broadcast of Translucent stepping out of the void had been seen by 3 billion people, and within minutes, the fundamental fear of mortality that held human civilization together began to unravel. People stopped braking for red lights. They walked out of offices in the middle of meetings to stand on ledges staring at the sun. If death was fixable, then consequence was a myth. In the sub-basement bunker, Butcher watched the societal collapse on the wall of monitors with a grim detachment that masked a terrified realization that he was no longer fighting a company, but a mass psychosis. The miracle had done more damage than any bomb. It had removed the checkmate from the game. Frenchie was frantically working on the weather modification schematics, his hands stained with ink and engine grease, muttering that the atmospheric pressure was dropping in a way that defied meteorology. He claimed the sky was getting heavier because it was physically lowering. The barrier between the hell dimension Mephisto inhabited and Earth was compressing, and the friction was generating heat that smelled like burning hair. The catastrophe was not limited to New York. In Russia, a Vought subsidiary facility housing the Soup Love sausage exploded, but instead of debris, it rained tentacles that grafted themselves onto the landscape, turning a forest into a writhing biomechanical nightmare. In the Vatican, the statues of the saints wept oil that caught fire spontaneously. The global reality was being overwritten by the logic of a comic book written by a madman. Mephisto was not just invading, he was editing. The 7 were gathered in the wreckage of the green room inside the tower. They were silent. The hierarchy had been flattened. Homelander sat on a folding chair, his suit scorched from his own black fire test, his eyes unfocused. He could feel the new power coiling in his gut, a parasite that offered strength in exchange for autonomy. He looked at the deep, whose gills were gasping in the dry air. The deep whispered that the ocean was talking to him, but it wasn't fish anymore. It was the drowned. He said they were organizing an army in the trench. He said they wanted to come up for the expo. Homelander didn't answer. He was listening to a voice that only he could hear. Mephisto's voice. It was calm, paternal, and relentless. It told him that the pain he felt was just his humanity dying. It told him to let it go. It told him that a true God doesn't have a conscience, he only has a will. Starlight stood by the window, looking out at the purple clouds. She felt dirty. The resurrection ritual had used her light as a battery, and she felt that a piece of her had stayed inside the void. She looked at her hands. They were trembling. When she summoned her power, the sparks were no longer golden. They were pale, anemic white, like the belly of a dead fish. She realized that her power source was not infinite. It was connected to the moral fabric of the universe, and that fabric was rotting. She turned to Queen Maeve, who was drinking heavily from a bottle of whiskey that she had looted from Edgar's office. Maeve looked at Annie and shook her head. She said there was no way out. She said she had tried to leave the tower an hour ago, but the doors wouldn't open for her. The building knew she wanted to quit. It was alive. The elevator shafts were pulsing. The security cameras tracked them with predator intent. They were rats in a digestive tract. Suddenly, the screens in the room flickered to life. It was not a broadcast. It was a direct feed. Mephisto's face appeared. He was sitting in the Oval Office, his feet up on the resolute desk. The president was kneeling beside him, signing a stack of documents that seemed to be endless. Mephisto addressed the seven. He told them that the merger was complete. Vought had acquired the executive branch. He announced the first initiative of the new administration. It was called the Purification. He explained that the populace was too chaotic to be properly ruled. They needed to be sorted. He was activating the reserve soups. Every C-list hero, every reject, every washout in the Vought database was being activated and given the upgrade. They would be the new peacekeepers. They would enforce the new laws. Law number 1, worship is mandatory. Law number 2, despair is currency. Law number 3, the seven were no longer celebrities. They were high priests. And tonight, they had a service to conduct. The feed cut. A siren began to wail throughout the city. It wasn't an air raid siren. It was a sound recorded from the deepest borehole in Siberia, a scream of tectonic agony looped and amplified. The doors to the green room slid open. Standing there was Black Noir. But he wasn't silent. He was weeping. Deep, guttural sobs shook his frame. He pointed down the hall. Homelander stood up. He walked past Noir. He walked to the balcony. He looked down at the city. The streets were filling with the peacekeepers. They were twisted versions of the heroes they used to be. A soup with elastic limbs was stretching himself across an intersection, acting as a living barricade catching cars in his flesh. A hero with acid spit was melting the foundations of a church. They were herding the civilians into the subway entrances. They were moving them underground, toward the heat. Butcher saw the movement on the tactical map. He realized the strategy. Mephisto wasn't trying to rule the surface. He was dragging the population down. He was turning New York into a circle of hell. Butcher grabbed the weather modification drive. He told the boys they were leaving. They weren't going to the satellite uplink station. That was too slow. They were going to the source. They were going to the Vought pharmaceutical plant in New Jersey, where the weather compounds were mixed. If they couldn't control the satellites, they would spike the supply chain. They loaded into a stolen ambulance. The city was a war zone. They drove through streets paved with broken glass and abandoned cars. They saw things that defied description. A man fusing with a mailbox. A dog walking on two legs speaking Latin. The laws of physics had become suggestions. As they crossed the George Washington Bridge, a figure blocked their path. It was A-Train. He wasn't running. He was vibrating. His skin was peeling off, revealing raw muscle underneath. He was holding a heart in his hand. It was still beating. He looked at the ambulance. He smiled, a rictus of pain and ecstasy. He said the tolls had gone up. He said the toll was a life. Butcher didn't slow down. He gunned the engine. He told MM to take the wheel. Butcher climbed into the back. He grabbed the RPG. He didn't aim at A-Train. He aimed at the bridge support cables. He fired. The rocket severed the main cable. The bridge groaned and twisted. The road deck buckled. A-Train lost his footing. The vibration stopped for a second as he tried to regain balance. In that second, Kimiko kicked the back doors open and leaped. She tackled A-Train mid-air. They fell toward the Hudson River. Butcher screamed. But Kimiko didn't let go. She drove her claws into A-Train's chest as they hit the water. The impact was like hitting concrete. The ambulance skidded to a halt on the Jersey side. Butcher scrambled out, looking over the edge. The water was boiling. Black bubbles were rising to the surface. There was no sign of Kimiko or A-Train. Huey fell to his knees, screaming her name. Butcher grabbed him by the collar and hauled him up. He said she was gone. He said she did the job. He said they had to move or it was for nothing. He shoved Huey into the driver's seat. They drove on, leaving the river burning behind them. The loss was a physical weight in the vehicle. The team had been severed. The silence was louder than the sirens. They arrived at the chemical plant. It was guarded not by humans, but by the corrupted science team. Creatures that used to be men in lab coats, now scurrying on the ceiling, dropping acid from their mouths. Butcher led the assault. He used a shotgun loaded with shells, packed with rock salt and iron filings. It was messy, but effective. The iron burned the corrupted flesh. They fought their way to the main mixing vat. The vat was the size of a swimming pool filled with a silver liquid, the base for the weather control aerosol. Frenchie rigged the canister of the holy water mixture to the intake valve. He calculated the dispersal rate. He said it would take 10 minutes to mix and deploy into the atmosphere. Once it hit the air, the reaction would create a rainstorm of consecrated acid. It would burn anything with Hell V in its blood. It would burn the soups. It might burn them too if they were contaminated. Butcher stood guard at the door. He checked his ammo. 2 shells left. He heard footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps. The door was ripped off its hinges. Standing there was Homelander. But he wasn't flying. He was walking. He looked broken. His suit was torn. His cape was gone. He looked at Butcher. He didn't fire his lasers. He looked at the vat. He looked at the holy water. He asked Butcher if it would hurt. His voice was small. Butcher lowered the shotgun slightly. He looked at the monster who had taken everything from him. He saw the torment in Homelander's eyes. He saw the slavery. Butcher spat blood. He said, yeah. He said it would hurt like hell. He said that was the point. Homelander nodded. He stepped aside. He let them work. He said he wanted it to hurt. He said he wanted to feel something real. Frenchie threw the lever. The mixture hissed into the vat. The alarm screamed. The ventilation fans kicked on, sucking the tainted silver cloud up into the stacks. Outside, the sky began to churn. The purple clouds turned a violent, bruised black. Thunder shook the ground. The first drops of the new rain began to fall. It wasn't water. It was judgment. On the bridge, A-Train surfaced, gasping, his skin smoking as the rain hit him. In the tower, the windows began to melt. In the streets, the peacekeepers screamed as their skin began to boil. The rain didn't wash away the sins. It cauterized them. Butcher watched the monitor. He saw the city smoking. He saw the chaos intensify. But then he saw something else. The rain wasn't stopping the demons. It was making them angry. The Hell V adapted. The creatures on the monitors began to shed their skin, emerging redder, stronger, and more immune. The holy water had stripped away the human disguises. Now there were only monsters. Mephisto's voice echoed over the plant's intercom system. He laughed. He thanked them for the baptism. He said he always preferred his subjects stripped of their vanity. He said now the real work could begin. They realized the total strategic failure. They hadn't cured the infection. They had accelerated the evolution. The rain fell harder, sizzling on the roof, and in the corner of the room, the shadow of the mixing vat began to stand up. It had eyes, and they were looking at Huey. The shadow that rose from the mixing vat did not behave like gas or liquid, but like a solid curtain of absence that folded over itself with the sound of snapping dry bones. It lunged at Huey not with speed, but with an inevitability that froze his motor functions. Frenchie screamed and threw a canister of liquid nitrogen at the entity, but the cold did not freeze it. Instead, the nitrogen simply ceased to exist when it touched the darkness, as if the shadow was a hole in the universe deleting matter on contact. Butcher grabbed Huey by the back of his tactical vest and yanked him backward, just as the shadow clamped down on the metal grating where Huey had been standing, shearing through 3 inches of industrial steel without a sound. The entity expanded, filling the room with a pressure that popped the capillaries in their noses. Homelander stood in the center of the swirling darkness, unmoving. He looked at the creature with dead eyes. The shadow lashed out a tendril of pure void wrapping around Homelander's neck. For a moment, the strongest soup on Earth did nothing. He simply let the darkness choke him, his face remaining slack and impassive, as if he were waiting for death to finally do its job. Then the survival instinct that had been bred into his cells by Vogelbaum kicked in. Homelander's eyes didn't glow red, they flashed white. He let out a scream that wasn't a vocalization, but a shockwave of telekinetic panic. He didn't laser the shadow, he tore it apart with his hands, ripping the void as if it were heavy fabric. The sound was deafening, a shriek of tearing reality. The shadow recoiled, temporarily stunned by the sheer biological force of the demigod. Butcher didn't wait to see round 2. He kicked the service door open and shoved and Frenchie through. He grabbed Huey, who was staring at Homelander with a mixture of horror and pity, and dragged him into the hallway. They sprinted through the corridors of the chemical plant, which were now pulsing. The walls were no longer concrete, they were lined with veins. The pipes overhead were pumping a thick red slurry that leaked from the joints. The plant was becoming an organ. They burst out into the parking lot, into the pouring, caustic rain. The world outside had ended while they were inside. The holy acid rain had not cleansed the earth, it had dissolved the illusion. The sky was a bruised purple, swirling with faces that screamed silently. The tarmac was soft and sticky like tar. In the distance, the skyline of New York was visible, but it was wrong. The buildings were twisting, stretching upward like stalagmites in a cave. Vought Tower was the center of the corruption, a black needle piercing the clouds, feeding the storm. Butcher slammed the door of a stolen maintenance truck and gunned the engine. The tires spun in the black sludge before catching traction. As they sped away, the chemical plant behind them groaned and collapsed in on itself, not falling down, but being pulled down into the earth, consumed by the hellmouth that had opened beneath it. Homelander did not emerge. Butcher looked at the rearview mirror, his face grim. He told the team that the scorched earth policy was off the table because there was no earth left to scorch. They needed a new plan. Frenchie was huddled in the passenger seat, staring at his hands. He said the math was wrong. He said he calculated the energy density of the shadow and it was negative. It was feeding on the kinetic energy of their attacks. Violence was just fuel. Asked how they were supposed to fight a war without fighting. Butcher didn't answer. He was thinking about the only thing that terrified him more than Mephisto. He was thinking about Ryan. Inside the shifting geometry of Vought Tower, Starlight and Queen Maeve were trapped on the 82nd floor. The elevators were gone, replaced by vertical shafts of fleshy cartilage that breathed. The stairs had flattened into smooth slides of bone. They were trying to descend, but the building was fighting them. Every door they opened led to a nightmare. One room was filled with mirrors that showed their deaths in infinite variation. Another was a void, where gravity was reversed. Maeve was bleeding from a gash on her forehead, where a painting of herself had flown off the wall and attacked her. She was sobering up fast, and the clarity was worse than the drunkenness. She smashed a hole in the drywall with her fist, looking for a structural beam to climb down, but instead of steel, she found a massive spinal column. The building was a titan, and they were inside its chest. Starlight charged her hands with light, but the electricity was weak, flickering against the oppressive magical weight. She said she could feel the power dampeners, but they weren't technological, they were emotional. The tower was feeding on their hopelessness. Suddenly, the floor beneath them turned to liquid. They fell splashing into a pool of dark, icy water that had flooded the 79th floor. They surfaced, gasping. The water was waist-deep and smelled of brine and rot. Ripples moved across the surface coming from the shadows at the far end of the open-plan office. The Deep emerged from the darkness, but he was no longer the man they knew. His skin had turned a translucent green, revealing the organs pulsing underneath. His gills had expanded, tearing open his neck to reveal rows of shark-like teeth. He was riding a wave of water that defied gravity, hovering in the air behind him like a cape. He held a trident made of coral that glowed with a sick, necromantic light. He smiled and his mouth was too wide. He told the ladies that the Lord of the Flies had given him a promotion. He was the Warden of the Drowned now. He raised the trident, and the water in the room surged, turning into grasping hands that grabbed Maeve and Annie. Maeve roared and tore the water hands apart, her strength still formidable. She charged at the Deep, splashing through the flooded office. The Deep didn't move. He simply pointed the trident. A blast of pressurized water hit Maeve in the chest with the force of a freight train, slamming her back into a support pillar. The pillar cracked. Maeve coughed blood. Starlight screamed and unleashed a blast of light aiming for the Deep's eyes. The light hit him and sizzled, but the Deep just laughed. He said light doesn't travel well in the abyss. He summoned a shark from the water, a spectral rotting thing that swam through the air, and sent it at Annie. Maeve recovered and intercepted the beast, catching it by its jaws and ripping it in half with a sickening crunch. She shouted at Annie to run. She said she would hold the fish boy off. Annie hesitated. Maeve looked at her with desperate eyes. She said she wasn't leaving without a fight, but Annie had work to do. Annie was the only one who could burn the shadows if she figured out how. Maeve shoved Annie toward the window. Annie looked back one last time, seeing Maeve tackle the Deep into the dark water, the two of them disappearing beneath the surface in a churning, violent froth. Annie blasted the window out and jumped. She didn't fly. She fell. The wind rushed past her. She closed her eyes and focused not on the electricity in the walls, but on the sun above the clouds. She caught an updraft of thermal energy and leveled out, gliding toward the chaotic streets below. She was alone. In the Oval Office. Mephisto was bored. He sat behind the desk, playing solitaire with cards that screamed when he flipped them. Stan Edgar stood by the fireplace, watching the news feeds on a floating holographic screen. The news was just a loop of riots and mass suicides. Edgar commented that the market had crashed completely. Money was worthless. The new currency was favors. Mephisto chuckled. He said that was always the currency. Humans just liked to pretend it was paper. He looked at Edgar. He asked if the CEO was afraid. Edgar took a sip of his scotch. He said fear was a reaction to the unknown. He knew exactly what was happening. It was a hostile takeover. He was just waiting to see if he would be retained as a consultant or liquidated as an asset. Mephisto admired the man's icy pragmatism. He flicked a card at Edgar. It was the Joker. The card stuck in Edgar's lapel. Mephisto said he had a special job for Edgar. He needed someone to manage the harvest. The souls were coming in too fast. The intake processing in hell was backed up. He needed corporate efficiency applied to damnation. Edgar nodded slowly. He asked what the compensation package was. Mephisto smiled. He said Edgar would get to keep his mind, while everyone else lost theirs. It was a generous offer. Butcher and the team were hiding in the basement of a bodega in Queens. The owner was dead. Behind the counter, his eyes burned out. They were eating stale chips and trying to ignore the sounds of slaughter outside. Huey was rocking back and forth. He said they couldn't win. He said it was biblical. Butcher slapped the table. The noise made everyone jump. Butcher said he didn't care if it was biblical or nautical or astrological. If it bled, they could kill it. If it didn't bleed, they would find a way to make it start. He pulled a map out of his pocket. It was a map of the upstate region. He circled a location. The cabin where Becca had lived. Where Ryan was. Looked at the map. He asked Butcher what the play was. Butcher looked him in the eye. He said the kid was the only thing on the planet that was born of both worlds. Half soup, half human, but raised in a bubble. He was a blank slate. But he had Homelander's power. And maybe something else. Butcher said they were going to get the kid, and they were going to point him at the devil. Shook his head. He said that was crossing a line, using a child as a weapon. Butcher laughed a harsh, barking sound. He said the line was crossed when the sky turned into a sphincter. There were no lines, only targets. The door to the bodega jingled. It wasn't a wind chime, it was the bell. Someone walked in. The team drew their weapons. But it wasn't a demon. It was Soldier Boy. He looked rough. His shield was dented. His suit was covered in green slime. He was smoking a cigar that smelled like burning tires. He looked at the boys. He spat on the floor. He asked if anyone had a light. Butcher lowered his gun slightly. He asked where the old man had been. Soldier Boy grunted. He said he had been fighting a giant squid in the Hudson. He said the world had gone to shit, and he wanted to know who was in charge so he could punch them in the throat. Butcher smiled. It was a cold, predatory smile. He said he knew exactly who was in charge. He told Soldier Boy to grab a bag of chips. They were going on a road trip. Meanwhile, high in the atmosphere, Homelander was floating. He had fled the chemical plant. He was hiding in the ionosphere where the air was thin and cold. He was shivering, not from cold, but from withdrawal. The adoration was gone. The fear was gone. He was just a speck of biology in a magical universe. He closed his eyes and tried to listen for the heartbeat of the world. But all he heard was Mephisto's laughter. It was everywhere, inside his head, inside his cells. He realized then that he couldn't run. The contract he had put in his pocket wasn't just paper. It was an anchor. He pulled it out. The parchment was glowing. He stared at the signature line. It was blank. He held the pen. He looked down at the burning world. He thought about Ryan. He thought about the weakness he felt when the shadow choked him. He hated the weakness. He hated the silence. He made a decision. He wasn't going to sign the contract to serve Mephisto. He was going to sign it to get close enough to kill him. It was a child's logic, a desperate gamble of a narcissist who thought he could outsmart the devil. Homelander signed his name. The moment the ink touched the paper, the sky turned red. A bolt of black lightning struck Homelander. He screamed as his biology was rewritten. His blue suit turned black. His cape turned into wings of leathery skin. His eyes ceased to be human. He wasn't just a soup anymore. He was the Avatar. He fell from the sky like a meteor, heading straight for the White House. The escalation had reached its peak. The players were converging. Butcher was racing toward the innocent. Soldier Boy was locked and loaded. Starlight was falling toward the streets. And Homelander had just sold his soul to buy a sword. The chain reaction was complete. There was no going back. The war for reality had transitioned from a skirmish to a slaughter. The board was set for the final sacrifice. The highway leading out of the city was a graveyard of stalled vehicles and crystallized ash that crunched under the tires of the stolen utility truck like powdered glass. The sky above was no longer a bruised purple, but a flat, oppressive gray that seemed to absorb sound, rendering the roar of the engine dull and distant. Inside the cab, the air was thick with the smell of stale sweat and the ozone stench radiating from Soldier Boy, who sat in the passenger seat cleaning his fingernails with a combat knife. Butcher drove with a white-knuckled grip on the wheel, his eyes scanning the horizon for the telltale shimmering distortions that indicated a reality fracture. In the back, and Frenchie were silent, guarding Huey, who had lapsed into a catatonic state, staring at a picture of Starlight on his cracked phone screen. The team was broken, held together only by the gravity of Butcher's obsession. Soldier Boy broke the silence, not with wisdom, but with a complaint about the lack of good music on the radio, which was currently playing a looped broadcast of a weeping child. Butcher told him to shut his mouth before he put a bullet in it. Soldier Boy laughed, a low rumbling sound that vibrated in the truck's chassis. He told Butcher that bullets were just polite suggestions to men like him. He asked what the plan was when they found the kid. Butcher didn't answer immediately. He was running the calculus of the damned. He knew that Ryan was the only being on the planet with the potential to hurt Homelander, but he also knew that pointing a child at the devil was a moral event horizon from which there was no return. He finally said they were going to give the boy a choice. Soldier Boy scoffed. He said choices were for civilians. Soldiers followed orders. He looked out the window at a herd of deer that were running alongside the highway. The deer had no skin, and their antlers were burning with blue fire. Soldier Boy took a drag from a flask of whiskey and muttered that the world had gotten ugly while he was asleep. He said he preferred the Russians. At least the Russians were human. Hundreds of miles south, in the ruin of Washington, D.C., the new Homelander stood on the lawn of the White House. The grass was dead, replaced by black brambles that whispered his name. His transformation was complete. The suit he wore was no longer the patriotic spandex of Vought's marketing department. It was a carapace of hardened shadow woven from the fabric of the dimension Mephisto called home. His cape was a membrane of smoke that trailed behind him like a funeral shroud. He felt power coursing through him that made Compound 5 feel like caffeine. It was ancient and intelligent. It whispered to him that he was finally free of the human need for approval. He was no longer a product. He was a prince. But as he walked toward the Oval Office, he felt a tug on his soul, a physical leash. He stopped trying to resist it, but his legs moved on their own. He marched into the office where Mephisto was waiting. The room had been redecorated. The portraits of past presidents were gone, replaced by mirrors that showed the viewer their own rotting corpse. Mephisto sat behind the desk, eating an apple that bled when he bit into it. He didn't look up. He told Homelander that he was late. Homelander tried to speak, to assert his dominance, to demand respect. But his mouth didn't open. His vocal cords were paralyzed. Mephisto swallowed a chunk of the apple and smiled. He explained the fine print of the contract. He said that Homelander had signed away his agency in exchange for potency. He was the Avatar now, the sword of the morning, and swords do not speak. They cut. Mephisto stood up and walked around the desk. He reached out and patted Homelander on the cheek. The touch burned like liquid nitrogen. He told Homelander that there was one loose end. The boy. The biological offspring. Mephisto said he could smell the potential in the child. A half-breed. A bridge between the dying world of men and the rising world of gods. He wanted the boy. He didn't want him dead. He wanted him educated. He ordered Homelander to retrieve the asset. He snapped his fingers, and Homelander's paralysis broke. The soup gasped, falling to his knees. He looked up at Mephisto with hatred that burned hotter than his lasers. Mephisto just laughed. He said hatred was good fuel. He told him to go. Homelander stood up. He walked to the balcony. He launched himself into the air, not with the sonic boom of displaced air, but with a silent tear in the atmosphere. He flew north, following the scent of his own blood. Starlight was walking through the subway tunnels beneath Manhattan. The air was cold and damp, smelling of sewage and something sweeter, like rotting flowers. She was using her hand as a flashlight, the golden glow illuminating the graffiti on the walls, which had shifted from gang signs to apocalyptic prophecies. She was looking for survivors. She had found a pocket of resistance, a group of civilians hiding in the maintenance shafts led by a transit worker named Gary. Gary was bleeding from a wound in his side that wouldn't clot. He told her that the surface was gone. He said the peacekeepers were harvesting people. They weren't killing them. They were taking them to the stadiums. Starlight asked what was happening in the stadiums. Gary cried. He said they were building a choir. Starlight didn't understand until they reached the 42nd Street station. They looked down from the ventilation grate. The platform was packed with thousands of people standing shoulder to shoulder. They weren't moving. They were humming, a low resonant frequency that made the teeth ache. In the center of the track stood a creature that looked like a conductor, but its limbs were elongated, and it had no face, just a single vertical mouth. It was waving a baton made of bone. Every time it waved, the crowd's hum rose in pitch. Starlight saw the energy leaving the people. Wisps of white light were being drawn out of their mouths, swirling into the air, and feeding a massive, pulsating crystal suspended from the ceiling. They were batteries, just like she was. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Mephisto wasn't just torturing humanity. He was using their souls to anchor his dimension to Earth. The despair was the energy source. Starlight looked at her hands. Her light was the same energy. If she used it, she was feeding the machine. If she didn't use it, she couldn't save anyone. It was a paradox designed to break her spirit. She looked at Gary. He was fading. She made a choice. She wouldn't use the light to fight. She would use it to disrupt. She closed her eyes and focused on the frequency of the hum. She began to sing. Not a song, but a countertone. A pure, clear note of defiance. The light from her hands changed, turning from gold to a blinding antiseptic white. She projected the sound and the light into the station. The crystal vibrated. The conductor shrieked. The connection broke. The people on the platform gasped, waking up from the trance. Chaos erupted. The conductor lunged at the grate. Starlight blasted it not with a beam, but with a flashbang of pure will. The creature recoiled, blinding. She yelled for Gary to run. She knew she had just rung a dinner bell for every demon in the city. She ran into the dark tunnels, her light fading, her energy critically low. She had saved a few thousand souls for an hour, but she knew the cost. She could feel the darkness encroaching on her own mind. The cabin upstate was surrounded by a forest that was trying to strangle it. The trees had moved closer in the night, their branches intertwining to form a cage. Grace Mallory stood on the porch, a modified assault rifle in her hands. The barrel was etched with runes that Butcher had texted her before the phones died. She didn't know if they worked, but she had nothing else. Ryan was inside, sitting at the kitchen table, playing with a set of Lego blocks. He was building a wall, higher and higher. He was trying to block out the noise in his head. He looked up when he heard the truck engine. It wasn't the roar of a monster. It was the rattle of a diesel engine. Mallory lowered the rifle slightly as the utility truck smashed through the tree line and skidded to a halt in the dirt driveway. Butcher jumped out before the wheels stopped moving. He marched up the steps, his trench coat flapping in the wind. Mallory blocked his path. She asked him if he brought the cavalry. Butcher jerked a thumb at the truck, where Soldier Boy was stepping out, stretching his neck. Mallory's face went pale. She knew the file. She knew what Soldier Boy was. She asked Butcher if he was insane. Butcher said sanity was a luxury they lost on Tuesday. He pushed past her into the cabin. He saw Ryan. The boy looked small, too small for the burden he carried. Ryan looked at Butcher. He asked if his dad was coming. Butcher knelt down. He looked the kid in the eye. He didn't lie. He said yes. He said his dad was coming, but he wasn't his dad anymore. He was a bad dream, and they were going to wake up. Soldier Boy walked onto the porch. He looked at the rune-etched rifle and snorted. He asked Mallory if she was hunting witches. Mallory stared at him with cold hate. She said she was hunting mistakes, and he was the biggest one Vought ever made. Soldier Boy smirked. He said he liked a woman with spirit. He looked at the forest. The shadows were lengthening. He said they had company. The trees were moving, not swaying in the wind, but uprooting. The bark split open, revealing red muscle. The trees were legs. The forest was a legion of wood golems animated by the spirits of the damned. They were closing in. Butcher came back out, dragging Ryan by the hand. Ryan was crying. He didn't want to leave his Legos. Butcher told him to focus. He told him to get angry. and Frenchie took up positions at the windows. Huey stood by the back door and holding a pistol he didn't know how to use. Soldier Boy cracked his knuckles. He said finally, "Something to hit." He leaped off the porch, charging the first treant. His shield slammed into the wooden creature, shattering it into splinters. But the wood didn't die. It reformed. The splinters crawled back together, knitting themselves into a sharper, deadlier form. Soldier Boy roared and punched the creature's core. His fist glowed with radioactive energy. The explosion was small, but intense. It vaporized the wood. The creature screamed a sound like a splitting violin and dissolved into ash. Soldier Boy laughed. He said they could bleed. The battle for the cabin was a chaotic, desperate skirmish. Laid down suppressive fire with incendiary rounds that Frenchie had whipped up from fertilizer and gasoline. The fire slowed the creatures but didn't stop them. There were too many. They were drowning in wood and sap. Butcher was firing his shotgun, blowing limbs off the attackers while keeping Ryan behind him. He yelled at the kid to use his eyes, to blast them. Ryan shook his head. He was paralyzed with fear. He said he didn't want to hurt anyone. Butcher grabbed him by the collar. He shouted that they weren't people. They were kindling. He needed the weapon. Suddenly the sky split open. A black sonic boom flattened the forest. The wood golems froze, then fell to the ground in reverence. Homelander descended. He landed in the clearing, creating a crater of fused dirt. He looked different. The black suit, the wings, the dead eyes. He looked at the cabin. He looked at Soldier Boy. He didn't say a word. He just extended a hand toward the house. The front wall of the cabin ripped away, exposing the interior like a dollhouse. Ryan screamed. Soldier Boy looked at Homelander. He recognized the DNA. He recognized the arrogance. He spat blood on the ground. He said he was disappointed. He said he thought his upgrade would be tougher. He charged. Homelander didn't flinch. He caught Soldier Boy's shield with one hand. The impact cracked the ground for 50 yards. Homelander backhanded Soldier Boy, sending him flying through the remains of the cabin and into the mountainside behind it. Butcher opened fire. The bullets bounced off Homelander's new skin without even scratching the paint. Homelander walked toward Ryan. He ignored Butcher. He ignored Mallory, who was emptying her magazine into his back. He only saw the boy. Ryan stood up. His eyes began to glow. Not red, but a soft, hopeful gold. He told his dad to stop. Homelander paused. The humanity deep inside him, the tiny fragment that Mephisto hadn't digested, flickered. He reached out a hand. But it wasn't a hand of comfort. It was a claw. He telepathically projected a thought to Ryan. "Come with me. We will be gods." Ryan stepped back. He said no. Soldier Boy erupted from the rubble. He was glowing bright red. His chest was a nuclear reactor going critical. He was charging his chest beam. The blast that stripped powers. The blast that killed everything in its path. He screamed a war cry. He aimed at Homelander, but Homelander was standing directly in front of Ryan. If Soldier Boy fired, he would incinerate the boy. Butcher saw the geometry of the shot. He saw Soldier Boy's eyes. There was no hesitation. Soldier Boy didn't care about the kid. He just wanted to kill the replacement. Butcher had a split second. The strategic reversal the prompt demanded. The choice that prevents one disaster while guaranteeing another. If he let Soldier Boy fire, Homelander might die or be depowered. But Ryan would definitely die. Becca's son. The last promise he kept. If he saved Ryan, he saved the potential weapon, but he lost the shot at Homelander. Butcher didn't think. He acted on an instinct that he thought he had buried with his wife. He tackled Ryan. He threw himself over the boy's small body, shielding him with his own trench coat. Soldier Boy fired. The beam of radioactive energy screamed across the clearing. It hit Homelander. Homelander howled. The black armor smoked. The wings withered. For a second, the demon was stripped away, revealing the terrified man underneath. But the blast wasn't sustained. Soldier Boy was tackled by a shadow beast that emerged from the ground. The beam cut off. Homelander fell to his knees, smoking and vulnerable. But he was alive, and he was angry. Butcher looked up. He was alive. Ryan was alive. But the opportunity was gone. Soldier Boy was buried under a pile of writhing darkness. Homelander was regenerating the black carapace, knitting itself back together stronger than before. The vulnerability had lasted 3 seconds. Butcher scrambled to his feet, pulling Ryan up. He aimed his gun. But it was too late. The air pressure dropped. The silence returned. Mephisto was there. He didn't descend from the sky. He stepped out of the shadow of the porch. He was wearing a flannel shirt and jeans, mocking the rustic setting. He applauded. He looked at Butcher. He said that was very touching. A true father figure. He looked at Ryan. He smiled. He said the boy had seen who protected him and who tried to kill him. He pointed at Soldier Boy, who was struggling to rise. He said that man wanted you dead. He pointed at Butcher. He said that man is too weak to save you. He looked at Homelander, who was standing up, shaking off the ash. He said, your father is a slave, but I offer you a kingdom. Ryan looked at Butcher. Butcher was bleeding, holding a useless gun, panting with exhaustion. He looked at Homelander, who was a monster. He looked at Mephisto, who looked like a friend. Mephisto knelt. He didn't touch Ryan. He offered him a contract, not a scroll of skin, a simple handshake. He said he could make the pain stop. He could make the noise go away. He could make sure no one ever hurt him again. All he had to do was come home. Butcher screamed, "No!" He lunged at Mephisto. Mephisto didn't move. He simply looked at Butcher, and Butcher's legs shattered. Both femurs snapped simultaneously with a sound like gunshots. Butcher collapsed, screaming in agony. Ryan's eyes went wide. He looked at Mephisto. Mephisto shrugged. He said he could fix that too, if the boy agreed. Ryan looked at Butcher writhing in the dirt. He looked at the chaos. He made the choice of a child who just wanted everyone to stop screaming. He took Mephisto's hand. The world stopped. The wind died. The gray sky turned a serene, terrifying blue. Mephisto stood up, holding Ryan's hand. He looked at Homelander. He said, "The boy comes with me. You stay here and clean up this mess." Homelander bowed his head, forced by the leash. Mephisto looked at Butcher. He said, "Thank you for keeping him fresh, Billy. I'll take good care of him." A portal opened. A tear in reality that showed a city of gold and fire. Mephisto walked through, pulling Ryan with him. The portal closed. Butcher lay in the dirt, unable to move. The pain in his legs was blinding, but the pain in his chest was worse. He had saved the boy's life only to hand his soul to the devil. He had made the moral choice, and it was the wrong one. Soldier Boy dragged himself out of the rubble, spitting teeth. He looked at Butcher. He looked at the empty space where the kid had been. He walked over to Butcher and kicked him in the ribs. He said, "You stupid son of a bitch, you missed." Homelander stood over them. He raised his hand, ready to finish it, to kill the men who had seen his weakness. But he stopped. He looked at the sky where his son had gone. He lowered his hand. He didn't kill them. He laughed. It was a broken sound. He said it didn't matter. Nothing mattered. He flew away, leaving the boys broken, bleeding, and defeated in the ruins of the only hope they had left. This ended not with a bang, but with the quiet realization of total defeat. The weapon was gone. The team was crippled. The enemy had the ultimate prize. And somewhere in a dimension of fire, a child was being taught that love was just another word for leverage. The war was no longer about saving the world. It was about avenging it. Butcher stared at the dirt, his vision blurring. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the vial of Compound 5 he had been saving. The temporary V. The suicide run. He uncorked it with his teeth. He looked at the closing darkness. He whispered, "Not yet." He jammed the needle into his neck, the sound of the plunger depressing and the sudden violent thumping of a heart refusing to die. The injection of temporary Compound 5 into Billy Butcher's neck did not result in a rush of euphoria, but a collision of two hostile, invasive species. The chemical sludge of the V met the ambient magical radiation of Mephisto's rewritten atmosphere, and the reaction was instantaneous and violent. Butcher arched his back in the dirt, his scream silenced by the blood filling his throat as his shattered femurs ground together. The bones did not knit gently. They fused with the sound of wet gravel being crushed in a vise. His marrow boiled. His eyes turned from brown to a luminous swirling yellow that cut through the gloom of the upstate forest. He stood up, not with human grace, but with the mechanical jerkiness of a puppet, whose strings were being pulled by rage alone. Soldier Boy watched him wiping the blood from his own mouth. He saw the steam rising from Butcher's skin. He saw the death sentence written in the Englishman's veins, which were turning black. Soldier Boy didn't ask if Butcher was okay, because he didn't care. He just asked if they were done losing. Butcher spat a glob of glowing saliva onto the ground where it hissed and burned a hole in the rock. He said they were going to the tower. He said they were going to kill the landlord. The drive back to the city was a blur of silence and speed. They didn't take the truck. Soldier Boy tore the door off a parked sedan and hot-wired it while Butcher sat in the passenger seat, staring at his hands, which were vibrating with enough potential energy to level a city block. They left the bodies of the wood golems rotting in the clearing. They left the ruins of the cabin. They left the ghost of the boy they had failed to save. When they reached the outskirts of New York, the scale of the convergence became clear. The city was no longer just burning, it was metabolizing. Vought Tower had grown, piercing the cloud layer like a jagged bone spike. The streets around it were a labyrinth of flesh and stone where the laws of physics had been repealed. Gravity fluctuated, causing cars to float and crash into buildings. Time looped in certain intersections, forcing people to relive their deaths over and over. At the base of the tower, they found Starlight. She was alone, kneeling amidst a pile of ash that used to be a battalion of Mephisto's peacekeepers. She looked up as Butcher and Soldier Boy approached. Her uniform was shredded. Her eyes were burned sockets of pure white light. She had pushed her power so far past its limit that she had burned away her own retinas, but she didn't need eyes to see anymore. She sensed the nuclear heat of Soldier Boy and the toxic storm of Butcher. She stood up, swaying slightly. She told them the lobby was breached, but the elevators were dead. She said the building was digesting anyone who tried to climb. Butcher looked at the tower. He laser-focused his vision on the penthouse. He could feel the pulse of the portal. He could feel Ryan. He told Starlight to stay down here and keep the door open. She shook her head. She said she was coming. She said she had one song left. They entered the lobby. It was a cathedral of gore. The reception desk was a mound of skulls. The Vought logo on the wall was weeping blood. From the shadows, the remnants of the Deep's aquatic army lunged. Fishmen with human faces screaming for water. Soldier Boy didn't break stride. He bashed the first one's skull in with his shield and incinerated the second with a point-blank blast from his chest. Butcher was a whirlwind of lasers and violence, slicing through the horde with surgical precision. They didn't fight as a team. They fought as three natural disasters occupying the same hallway. They reached the central shaft. The elevators were gone, replaced by a throat. The walls were lined with peristaltic muscle that squeezed and pulsed. Butcher looked up. It was a straight shot to the 99th floor. He looked at Soldier Boy. He sat up. Soldier Boy grabbed Butcher and Starlight. He crouched, cracking the floor tiles. He launched himself upward. They flew up the throat of the beast. The building tried to stop them. Tentacles of rebar and meat lashed out from the walls. Starlight blasted them with blinding flashes of white-hot plasma, searing the flesh and clearing the path. They crashed through the floor of the 99th floor landing in the boardroom. The room where it had all started. It was unrecognizable. The walls were gone, replaced by a panoramic view of the apocalypse. The sky outside was a swirling vortex of fire, and souls funneling into the ruby portal that hovered above the tower. And standing in front of the portal guarding the bridge to hell was Black Noir. But it wasn't the Black Noir they knew. It was a reanimated husk, filled with Mephisto's personal guard. He was 10 feet tall, his suit bursting at the seams. He didn't speak. He just drew a sword made of shadow. Soldier Boy laughed. He stepped forward. He said he had beaten this guy before. He charged. The collision shook the foundation of the tower, but this Noir didn't crumble. He caught Soldier Boy's fist. He twisted Soldier Boy's arm with a sickening crack. Soldier Boy roared and headbutted the giant. Butcher joined the fray, his lasers carving trenches into Noir's armor. Starlight unleashed a continuous beam of energy, pushing the giant back. It was a meat grinder. A brutal close-quarters brawl in the penthouse of the damned. Soldier Boy finally managed to jam his shield into Noir's neck, severing the jugular. Black smoke poured out instead of blood. The giant fell. They stepped out onto the balcony. The wind was howling, screaming names. In the center of the helipad stood Homelander, the Avatar. His wings were spread wide, casting a shadow that seemed to stretch for miles. Behind him the portal swirled, and inside the portal, visible through the tear, in reality sat Mephisto on a throne of obsidian. At his feet sat Ryan. The boy was different. He was older. Time moved faster in the slipstream. He was a teenager now, wearing a suit of armor that matched his father's. His eyes were cold. Homelander looked at the intruders. He didn't smile. He didn't monologue. He just pointed a finger. A blast of hellfire erupted from his hand. Butcher crossed his arms, taking the blast. His skin charred and healed in seconds. The pain was fuel. He charged at Homelander. Homelander caught him by the throat and flew him into the sky. They traded blows that shattered the sound barrier. Butcher was high on V and hate fighting with the desperation of a man who was already dead. He gouged at Homelander's eyes. He bit Homelander's nose. It was feral. Below them, Soldier Boy was charging up. His chest glowed with the intensity of a dying sun. He wasn't aiming at Homelander. He was aiming at the portal. He shouted at Starlight to shield him. He was going to nuke the door. Starlight raised a barrier of hard light, struggling to hold back the pressure of their hellstorm. Mephisto watched from his throne. He looked bored. He leaned down and whispered to Ryan. He told the boy to deal with the trash. Ryan stood up. He walked through the portal. He stepped onto the helipad. He looked at Soldier Boy. He raised his hand. His eyes glowed red. But it wasn't the chaotic red of the V. It was the precise, surgical red of a weapon. He fired. The laser hit Soldier Boy in the chest. It didn't burn him. It pushed the energy back in. It forced the nuclear reaction to stall. Soldier Boy gagged, choking on his own pour. Ryan was stronger. He was the upgrade. Butcher saw this from the air. He saw his son killing his teammate. He screamed. He broke Homelander's grip with a burst of strength that tore the muscles in his own arms. He fell from the sky, slamming into the helipad between Ryan and Soldier Boy. He stood up, swaying. He looked at Ryan. The boy's face was a mask of indifference. Butcher said his name. Ryan didn't blink. He said the man named Ryan was gone. He was the prince now. He raised his hand to kill Butcher. Suddenly, Homelander landed. He walked past Butcher. He walked up to Ryan. He looked at his son. He saw the armor. He saw the coldness. He saw the reflection of himself. And for the first time in his life, Homelander saw exactly how pathetic he was. He saw that Mephisto hadn't given him a legacy. He had stolen it. He had taken the only thing that was truly his and turned it into another employee, another product. The narcissism that defined Homelander, the absolute need to be the center of the universe, fractured. If Ryan was Mephisto's prince, then Homelander was just the chauffeur. Homelander turned to the portal. He looked at Mephisto. Mephisto smiled. He held up the contract. He reminded Homelander that he couldn't attack his master. The clauses were clear. Homelander's biology was bound. He couldn't lift a finger against the devil. Homelander's face twitched. He looked at Butcher. He looked at the nuclear bomb that was Soldier Boy struggling to breathe. He looked at Starlight, who was fading. Homelander spoke. His voice was a grinding rasp. He said he couldn't hurt Mephisto. The contract said he couldn't harm the employer, but the contract didn't say anything about the office. Homelander grabbed Soldier Boy. He didn't hit him. He hugged him. He wrapped his arms around the radioactive biological weapon. He lifted Soldier Boy into the air. Soldier Boy realized what was happening. He stopped fighting. He looked at Homelander. He grinned a bloody, broken grin. He said, "Let's go, buddy." Homelander didn't fly at Mephisto. He flew at the portal's frame, the anchor point, the mathematical coordinate where the Hell dimension touched Earth. Mephisto's eyes went wide. For the first time, the devil looked surprised. He stood up. He shouted a command in a tongue that cracked the pavement. "Stop!" Butcher understood. He tackled Ryan. He didn't try to fight him. He just tackled him, knocking him off the helipad away from the blast zone. They tumbled over the edge, falling toward the street. Homelander accelerated. He squeezed Soldier Boy. He used his heat vision to burn through Soldier Boy's skin, exposing the nuclear core directly. Soldier Boy let go. He released the energy. All of it. They hit the center of the portal. The explosion was silent. It was too loud for sound. It was a white hole, a sphere of absolute negation that expanded outward, erasing the top 20 floors of Vought Tower in a microsecond. The portal didn't just close, it shattered. The connection between dimensions was severed by the sheer, blunt force of a nuclear detonation, point blank in the doorway. The feedback loop traveled back into Mephisto's dimension. The throne room exploded. The devil was sucked back into the void, screaming not in pain, but in the frustration of a deal gone wrong. The shockwave hit the ground. Butcher and Ryan were shielded by the falling debris of the lower floors, but the impact still shattered Butcher's remaining ribs. They crashed into the crater of the street. Dust and silence covered New York. The red sky flickered and died, replaced by the dull gray of a normal rainy dawn. The magic evaporated. The peacekeepers in the streets dissolved into puddles of tar. The warped buildings groaned and settled back into Euclidean geometry or collapsed entirely. Butcher lay on his back. The Temp 5 was wearing off. The pain was returning a tidal wave of agony. He couldn't feel his legs. He couldn't feel his hands. He turned his head. Ryan was lying next to him. The armor had vanished when the magic died, leaving him in tattered clothes. The teenager sat up. He looked at his hands. He looked at the ruin of the tower. He looked at Butcher. The red glow was gone from his eyes. He looked confused, like a child who had woken up from a nightmare he couldn't remember. Starlight crawled out of the rubble nearby. She was alive. She checked herself. No broken bones. She looked at the crater where the tower stood. There was no sign of Homelander. There was no sign of Soldier Boy. They were gone. Erased. Butcher coughed blood. He tried to reach for his pocket for his cigarettes, but his arm wouldn't move. He laughed a wet, gurgling sound. He looked at the sky. It was ugly. It was gray. It was full of smog. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. The convergence was over. They hadn't won. The city was destroyed. The government was gone. The economy was zero. Millions were dead or traumatized. But the devil was gone. The lease was canceled. Ryan crawled over to Butcher. He looked at the broken man. He asked if his dad was dead. Butcher looked at the kid. He saw the mix of Homelander and Becca in his face. He saw the potential for good and the potential for horror. He knew that the boy had seen the other side. He knew that Ryan would never be normal. Butcher whispered. He said, "Yeah." He said, "They're all dead, son." He said, "It's just us now." And then Butcher closed his eyes. He didn't die. He was too stubborn to die. He just passed out from the pain, letting the darkness take him for a while. Sirens began to wail in the distance. Real sirens, human sirens. The National Guard was finally moving in. The cleanup crew. The camera pulls back, up through the dust, up past the ruin of the tower, up past the clouds, to the edge of the atmosphere. There is a scar in the fabric of space, a faint hairline fracture where the portal used to be. It is closed, but it is not healed. It will never heal. The universe has a crack in it now, and through the crack, if you listen very closely, you can hear a faint, slow clapping. Mephisto is not dead. He is just waiting for the next contract. But for now, the ink is dry. The screen fades to black. The only sound is the heartbeat of a boy sitting in the rubble, waiting for the world to tell him who he is. 6 months after the event, the congressional hearings were still ongoing, broadcast daily to a populace that watched with the hollowed-out exhaustion of survivors. Stan Edgar sat before the Senate Committee on Superhuman Affairs, his suit pristine, his demeanor unshakable. He claimed that Vought International was as much a victim of the hostile dimensional incursion as the citizens of New York. He argued that the sacrifice of the Seven's leader was proof of the company's ultimate dedication to planetary defense. The narrative was already setting in concrete. Homelander was a martyr. Soldier Boy was a tragic hero. Mephisto was classified as an extraterrestrial pathogen rather than a theological entity, because the government could not legislate against the devil, but they could sanction an alien virus. The exclusion zone in Midtown Manhattan remained sealed behind 20-foot concrete walls topped with sonic turrets. Inside the zone, the laws of physics were still loose. Gravity pockets would spontaneously invert, and shadows occasionally detached from their owners to walk independently for a few seconds before dissolving. It was a scar that would never fully heal, a reminder that the membrane of reality was thinner than anyone had believed. Billy Butcher watched the hearings from a wheelchair in a secure facility in the Catskills. The Temp 5 had fused his spine and burned out his nervous system, leaving him with tremors that made holding a cup of tea a tactical operation. He was technically a prisoner of the CIA, but practically he was a relic. Mallory visited on Sundays. She brought news of the outside world. She told him that Starlight had started a grassroots movement, a rehabilitation program for the people whose souls had been partially harvested. They called themselves the Hollows. They were quiet people who stared at the sun too long and wept when they heard music. Butcher didn't say much. He spent his time looking at the garden where Ryan sat. The boy was 14 now. He didn't float. He didn't use lasers. He sat perfectly still reading books on structural engineering. He was obsessed with how things were built, how to make them strong enough to not fall down. Butcher knew the kid was broken in a way that therapy couldn't fix. Ryan had worn the armor. He had felt the absolute power of the throne, and he had chosen to walk away. But the memory of that power was a ghost that lived in the boy's eyes. One afternoon, Butcher wheeled himself out to the patio. He looked at Ryan. He asked the boy if he ever heard the voice anymore. Ryan didn't look up from his book. He said no. He said the silence was loud, but it was just silence. Butcher nodded. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a scorched piece of metal. It was a fragment of Soldier Boy's shield found in the crater. He spun it on the table. It made a low humming sound. Butcher said they got lucky. He said the devil offered them a perfect world, and they spat in his face. Ryan finally looked up. He asked if it was worth it. Butcher looked at the wall around the facility. He looked at the gray sky, where the scar was still visible if you knew where to look. He thought about Becca. He thought about the millions dead. He thought about Homelander's final act of desperate humanity. He stopped the spinning metal with his thumb. He said it wasn't about worth. It was about being awake. He said they were awake now, and that was the punishment and the prize. The wind picked up blowing leaves across the lawn. For a second, the shadows of the leaves looked like grasping hands, but then the sun came out, and they were just shadows again. The world continued to turn damaged and heavy, but entirely its own.